So far, most of your discussions today have been focused around border security and the tools, the technology, the personnel issues that go into making success possible in that border security mission space. We're going to change gears a little bit with this panel discussion, and we're going to talk a little bit about the second big part of what CBP does, which is, of course, the economic prosperity of the country, the trade mission. So we're going to talk about a trade enforcement topic that has generated a great deal of interest for the past 18 months, primarily since a new law went into effect. And what that law is, that is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA, which went into effect in 2021. This is a big deal to CBP. This is a big deal to companies that bring foreign products into the United States. And it's a big deal to consumers because it directly impacts the availability of what you have to work with here in the United States. So we're going to change gears, talk about trade enforcement. I'm honored to be with Mr. Brian Hoxie, who leads CBP's Trade Enforcement Division within the Office of Trade. Brian has a long career within CBP, within DHS, and with elsewhere in the U.S. government. He's led many critical trade enforcement programs. He's led cargo security work, done some border security work as well. He's well-versed in the complex mission set that is CBP. So we will speak about the Forced Labor Prevention Act. We'll talk about some of the challenges, what this means to you all out there in the trade community. And let me just get started by talking a little bit about what that act is. And again, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act went into effect in December, or was signed into law in December of 2021 by President Biden. It went into effect 18 months later. So June of 2022 was when the Forced Labor Prevention Act took effect. And what this act does, and this act was several years in the making, there were different legislative versions that went through under the Trump administration, continued on into the Biden administration. But what the act is intended to do is to address the use of forced labor throughout global supply chains. So what the act gives CBP the authority to do is to prevent goods that are made with forced labor from entering the United States. There's a very powerful standard that this act established for the first time, and that is known as rebuttable presumption. And the way this works, and this is different from the way CBP has addressed trade enforcement historically, with rebuttable presumption, the U.S. government will identify areas of the world, certain products, certain inputs, certain regions that the government believes are made with forced labor. It is then upon the importer, the legal party that brings those goods in, to prove to CBP they were not made with forced labor. So somewhat of being guilty until you can prove yourself innocent, which is a complete paradigm shift from the way traditionally CBP has approached forced labor issues, which is CBP would be able to build a case to demonstrate your goods were inadmissible for whatever the underlying trade enforcement reason is. Because of the broad authorities that this statute provided CBP, CBP can now say, we believe goods coming out of the Xinjiang section of China, the province of China, are made with forced labor. And if you're bringing goods in from that section or from inputs that originated into that section, you have to prove to CBP, to their satisfaction, that these goods are not made with forced labor. That is a very, very high standard to achieve. It is one that requires extreme due diligence on the part of importing companies. Historically, companies understood their supply chains generally from where the product was manufactured coming forward into the United States. Under this law, you need to go back all the way to every single input that went into making these products, the production process, the transportation process, everything that goes into making a product, and be clear that it has not been exposed or impacted by forced labor. That is a very, very difficult standard. If you take a relatively simple supply chain, a manufacturing supply chain of, say, wearing apparel, where was the cotton grown? Where did the cotton get spun into yarn and into threads? Where was the threads and the yarns made into fabric? Where was the fabric made into a garment? That's a relatively simple supply chain. You have to account for all of the components. So again, where did the cotton grow? Where was the manufacturing that took place through various stages to end up with that final product? That's relatively simple. But everything that is involved with that product must be free from the taint of forced labor, or that entire supply chain is inadmissible. So we talked about the garment. What about the buttons? What about the dye that went into dyeing the yarn and the fabric? If any of that is tainted with forced labor, the entire product line is inadmissible into the United States. So this is a big deal for importing companies who rely heavily on the U.S. market. If CBP determines that your goods, again, applying the rebuttable presumption standard, are inadmissible to the United States, you've now lost access to the entire U.S. market. And I will tell you that the European community is not far behind CBP and the U.S. in adopting similar legislation to address forced labor. We talked about wearing apparel, a relatively simple supply chain. Electric vehicle batteries, upwards of 500 components and different entities go into making an electric vehicle battery. If you're an importer of those products, you need to be able to account for all of those inputs, all of those different entities that were involved, the production process through. It is not as simple as people believe. Well, I'm not dealing with Shenzhen products coming out of China, I'm good. If you look at CBP's trade enforcement statistics, more detentions for forced labor coming out of Malaysia, Vietnam, other Southeast Asian countries than China. And that's because the Chinese components are sent to these other Southeast Asian countries to be manufactured into that product. But again, if any one of those components is tainted by forced labor, the entire supply chain is inadmissible. So that is the context of what we're going to be speaking of today. Again, with Mr. Hoxie here, who leads CBP's efforts, we're going to be able to hear directly from him how they prioritize work, some of the challenges, some of the technology that they're using, and have a discussion with that. So with that as the background, I'll turn it over to Brian here. We talked about the challenges, the amazing authority that CBP was giving under this, but you still only have approximately 1,000 import specialists in the country, working at one of 10 different industry centers. How do you address the threat for forced labor coming out of China in varied industries?
Thanks. It is a challenge, and I think that we prioritize based on, first of all, there's the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, which was set up through the USMCA legislation that allows the Department of Homeland Security, working with our other interagency partners, to develop a strategy to address forced labor. So we focused on the first UFLPA strategy, which focused on apparel, cotton and cotton products, tomatoes, and then polysilicon. Those were the primary first priorities, and they're still our priorities. We're continually working on them. The implementation of the law started in, I want to get the date right, June 21st of 2022. And so we're about 1.5 years into that implementation. It's an enormous amount of work, so we're really focusing on those areas. However, if you don't deal with any of those areas, it doesn't mean that we're not looking at the potential for risk in other areas of the supply chains. So we enforce across the entire tariff schedule, as you mentioned, with our mission. That's every commodity that exists that we import. But what we're really looking at is, again, this is a risk management approach to look at the highest risks of materials or actual commodities that are made with forced labor from Xinjiang. We'll look at a number of different opportunities to evaluate that risk, and then whittle it down into different areas that we work with our 10 centers of excellence across the country who are the experts in those particular areas, and then work with them and then kind of spread the workload, I guess, more evenly across the country. So it is across the entire tariff schedule. I think that and what you spoke of about the in part, so the law says wholly or in part, and the shirt, where did the cotton come from? Where did the buttons come from? That's true for every single commodity that we deal with. And I think that, one thing, if you want to take away something from this particular panel that we're having, is forced labor can be present in any commodity. If you have an impart, one piece that's part of that entire supply chain, like you said, is completely forbidden from U.S. commerce. So Solar panels made with polysilicon. We know that polysilicon comes from Xinjiang region. That is a risk, a high risk area. That's why it made it into our priorities. So we're really looking at managing the risk from any of the commodities that come out of the region, and then asking the importers, like you said, working with the importer community and making sure that they have the information that they can provide to us to show us, yes, we've actually looked at our entire supply chain all the way down to the raw materials for the highest risk areas, and we can say definitively this did not come from the Xinjiang region, therefore it's admissible.
Yeah. And I think you raised a good point about, again, the law in whole or in part. The traditional customs arguments that have been used to define origin previously don't apply to forced labor. So this is not about, and this is getting a little trade wonky here, substantial transformation and de minimis. It is not about a input that loses its identity in the final product. Those are traditional customs arguments that are applied to rules of origin, establishment of admissibility, and things like that. The way this law is written, those don't apply. And companies will come and say, well, I don't really care about the buttons because it's such a small part of my final product. But the law cares about the buttons. So in whole or in part, you need visibility throughout your supply chains, the traceability, to be able to account for everything in whole or in part, because it's the slightest thing that if you're unaware of can knock you out of business, or at least make you very difficult to import into the United States. This is such a complex issue. Many companies struggle with this, even with large departments of compliance specialists, things of that nature. What kind of guidance has CBP put out there to help drive the efforts so that the companies know where to focus, how they prepare for what could be a game-changing action by CBP against their importations?
Sure. So we've provided all of our information we provide on our cbp.gov website. It's a continuous approach to give more guidance to the industry. We continually update it. We have, I think the number one document that I always recommend to everyone that they start with is the best practices for applicability reviews. It's a document, importer responsibilities document, that really sets the stage for, this is the type of information we're gonna look for if we stop a shipment. And that's probably the first place to get started. The other place I would say is really following the links that we have in the rest of the page to our other partners. The Department of Labor, International Labor Bureau has a number of products that they provide that shows goods made with forced labor. They have a report on that. The State Department has the Trafficking in Persons report, which will tell you countries of higher risk for trafficking or forced labor. And then on our website, we have sample table of contents, we have importer guidance, and we also have FAQs, which we update regularly. So we're continually looking at this to provide information to all companies, because the one thing that I leave with every one of these engagements is, don't start when you get a detention from CBP, right? If you get a detention from CBP, it's going to take you a lot longer than you think to get the documentation in order to provide to us. So get started early, do as much due diligence as you can early. It's only going to help you and limit the risk to your imports being stopped from CBP to get into the country. So that's really where all the information we have, and we continually push that out. DHS also has some other responsibilities too. Yep.
Yep, and I think that's good. As companies become more aware of the Forced Labor Prevention Act, and if they are operating in a higher risk environment, they really need to apply that due diligence, have that traceability throughout their supply chain. Let's talk real quickly about technology. There's a lot of technology vendors in here, but what technology is CBP using to help ascertain whether or not products are forced labor? What technology is out there for the commercial sector to draw from?
Sure. So we're using the same software technology that you can get. All of the information that we use and all the information that the private software vendors use, it has to be publicly available. We want to be on an even playing field with the importer community. We don't want to have a little black box that says, well, we found this information, you can't get it. We need to have the same exact information so that we can be fair in applying the law, because there's so much of an importance on the importer's responsibilities. So we use companies, we don't endorse particular products, but we do use some. One is called Altana and Sari, which are publicly knowledgeable, as well as a couple other products that we use internally, but we use these all as a part of a suite to do our analytics. And one of the things that we did to support the technology vendors that are out there is, in March we had a forced labor technical expo where we had 19 different vendors come in and present their particular products. So this included link analysis, of publicly available information on companies and how they're connected to subsidiaries and associations, et cetera. There's companies using AI in order to identify risks of forced labor. And then there's also some technology such as testing on isotopic testing, primarily in cotton right now, but there's other areas too. So this space has been very interesting for us because we're seeing a lot of innovation coming out of it. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, to innovate in this space and be able to provide more opportunity for, basically the importer community, but us as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And as much benefit as certain technologies can add, with this issue, there is no substitution for doing the deep dive on your entire end-to-end supply chain, doing the traceability, mapping out your production process, where things go. You will not satisfy CBP's, again, rebuttable presumption, that high standard, if you haven't put the work into this. In our last few minutes here, is there anything you need from that this type of audience can help you with?
Yeah, I think understanding your supply chains, again, that's going to be the number one thing. But I think, some may say, hey, I'm not an importer of record. I'm a vendor. I provide a particular capability. I purchase things from multiple different vendors. Maybe you're a manufacturer and you buy different components from overseas and you manufacture a lot of things here. It stands to be able to affect you, right? We're seeing, we have semiconductors. Semiconductors is pretty much everything we have now. A lot of that's made in China. Does it have a connection to Xinjiang? If it does, and your vendor or your supplier is not aware of these things, then that's going to jam you up, or has potential to jam you up at the border. So what we really want people to do is continue to share the message that this is an issue, that they need to understand their supply chains, work with your customers, your vendors, and understand that, hey, you've got a lot invested into this particular project you're working or this particular contract. There's an opportunity for risk there for you as well. So I think that's the one thing is that we always want to emphasize is know your supply chains, make sure that you continue to look at that, conduct due diligence, so that if we are stopped, if we do stop you, you've got the package ready to go and you can supply us with the information we need.
And I think that's great advice. I mean, the time to get your supply chain organized and account for the processes is now, before you have it stopped by CBP. My final comments as we close out this panel is that this issue will not go away. This issue has bipartisan support from both sides of the Hill. CBP's funding has increased to address this. Companies that think they're going to ride this out and wait for the next election, that is a naive assumption. This issue is not going away and something you need to focus on. The statistics tell the story. In fiscal year 22, 1,500 shipments detained, 896 refused, worth $469 million. FY23, the fiscal year that just ended, over 4,000 shipments detained, 1,600 refused, $1.4 billion in goods refused entry into the United States under forced labor. So this is an issue that people need to pay attention to. You need to know your supply chains, and the time to do that real work that Brian was talking about is not after CBP detained your goods. I do a lot of consulting in this space, and I have a lot of clients come to me and say, well, I've never had a detention, so I'm good. CBP must have looked at everything I've done, and they're satisfied. And I tell them, no, CBP has not gotten to you yet, because they're going to get to you. They have limited resources. This issue is not going away. Now is the time to do that deep dive on your supply chains before CBP gets to you. So I thank you for your time this afternoon. Again, this is a little bit different than some of the topics we've traditionally covered at this forum, but I hope you found it insightful. And if you are an importer of goods made foreign or a vendor who sources from someone after it's imported, you need to pay attention to this because it's going to have a detrimental impact on your U.S. market if you're not paying attention. So thank you very much for your attention.